In June of 1944, the eyes of the American public were firmly fixed on the beaches of Normandy, watching the liberation of Europe unfold in the blood and surf of Omaha Beach. But half a world away, across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean, an entirely different kind of amphibious nightmare was about to begin. This was a battle not for the liberation of a captive nation, but for a 72-square-mile piece of volcanic rock and coral that held the key to burning the Japanese Empire to the ground. The island was Saipan. The stakes were absolute. For the United States, taking Saipan meant securing a launch pad for the brand-new B-29 Superfortress, a bomber capable of bringing the war directly to the doorstep of Tokyo. For the Japanese, losing Saipan meant the collapse of the absolute national defense sphere, the psychological shattering of their high command, and the beginning of a relentless, fiery end. By the time the guns fell silent, over 25,000 Japanese soldiers would be dead. An entire civilian population would be decimated by mass suicide, and the Pacific War would cross a threshold of brutality that still haunts military planners today. Welcome back to the channel. If you are here, it means you want to look past the Hollywood myths and understand the cold, hard, mechanical realities of warfare. We analyze the tactics, the logistics, the firepower, and the fatal mistakes that define human conflict. If you want to dive deep into the absolute meat grinder of military history, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join our ranks. Now, let us look at the strategic chessboard of the Pacific in the summer of 1944. To understand why thousands of American Marines and infantrymen were sent to die on a small island in the Marianas, we have to rewind the clock and look at the grand strategy of the United States Army Air Forces. The United States had bet heavily on a technological marvel called the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This was a strategic bomber of unprecedented size and capability, costing the American taxpayer over $3 billion to develop. To put that into perspective, the B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project that built the atomic bomb. The Superfortress boasted a 120-foot wingspan, 4 massive Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, and a pressurized cabin that allowed it to fly at 30,000 feet, well above the effective range of most Japanese anti-aircraft fire and interceptors. It could carry a 20,000-pound bomb load over a maximum range of about 3,250 miles. But there was a massive logistical catch. A bomber with a 3,250-mile range can only strike targets about 1,500 miles away before it has to turn around and fly home. In 1944, the United States did not possess a single piece of real estate close enough to the Japanese home islands to launch these billion-dollar bombers. Why not just fly them from China? The Americans tried that under Operation Matterhorn, but flying aviation fuel and heavy bombs over the Himalayas from India into China was a logistical nightmare that burned more fuel than it delivered. The Army Air Forces needed a stable, secure, and massive aircraft carrier that could not be sunk. They needed the Mariana Islands. Look at a map of the Pacific. The Marianas chain, consisting of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, sits perfectly positioned in the Philippine Sea. Saipan is exactly 1,465 miles from Tokyo. It was the absolute sweet spot. If the United States Navy and Marine Corps could seize the Marianas, the Army Air Forces could pave over the sugarcane fields, build massive 8,500-foot runways, and subject the Japanese industrial heartland to a firebombing campaign the likes of which the world had never seen. But the Japanese High Command knew this just as well as the Americans did. The Marianas had been in Japanese hands since the end of World War I. granted to them as a League of Nations mandate. Over the decades, they had heavily colonized Saipan, turning it into a major producer of sugarcane and a forward bastion of their naval power. By late 1943, following a string of disastrous defeats in the Solomons and the Gilberts, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters drew a literal line in the ocean. They called it the Zettai Kokuboken, or the Absolute National Defense Sphere. This was an inner perimeter of island fortresses stretching from the Kuril Islands in the north down through the Marianas, the Carolines, and western New Guinea. The doctrine was simple and uncompromising. These islands were not outposts to be traded for time. They were the core territory of the empire, and they had to be held at all costs. If the Americans breached this line, the home islands would be exposed to strategic bombing, and the vital shipping lanes bringing oil and rubber from the Dutch East Indies to Japan would be severed. So why not just bypass Saipan, just like the Americans bypassed the massive Japanese fortress at Rabaul? It is a fair question. The island-hopping strategy championed by Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur relied heavily on the concept of leapfrogging. You bypass the strong points, cut off their supply lines, let them wither on the vine, and seize the weakly defended islands further ahead. This strategy is highly reminiscent of General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea during the American Civil War, where he cut loose from his traditional supply lines to directly strike the strategic and economic heart of the Confederacy, rendering massive Confederate field armies irrelevant. But you cannot bypass a target when the target itself is the strategic objective. Rabaul was a threat that could be neutralized by isolation. Saipan was a launch pad that had to be physically occupied to win the war. Furthermore, leaving an intact Japanese air and naval base squarely on the flank of any future advance toward the Philippines or Okinawa would be strategic suicide. Let us look at the force the United States assembled to crack this fortress. This was Operation Forager. The invasion fleet was staggering in its sheer scale, representing the peak of American industrial and logistical might. Over 535 ships were assigned to the operation, carrying more than 127,000 military personnel. The fleet had to sail 1,000 miles from their staging bases in the Marshall Islands and over 3,500 miles from the main naval base at Pearl Harbor. Supplying an armada of this size across that distance is an achievement that rivals the combat victory itself. It required millions of gallons of bunker fuel, thousands of tons of ammunition, and a constant stream of refrigerated supply ships to keep the men fed. The ground combat element was the 5th Amphibious Corps, commanded by Marine Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith. Smith was the godfather of American amphibious warfare, a ruthless, demanding commander who had little patience for incompetence and even less for the inter-service rivalries that plagued the Pacific theater. Under his command were 3 veteran divisions. The 2nd Marine Division, hardened by the bloody crucible of Tarawa. The 4th Marine Division, fresh off their successful assault on Roy Namur in the Marshalls. And the United States Army's 27th Infantry Division, a former New York National Guard unit that had seen action in the Gilberts. In total, Smith had over 71,000 assault troops ready to hit the beaches. They were backed by Task Force 58, the legendary fast carrier task force, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. This was the most destructive naval armada ever assembled, boasting 15 fleet and light aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and nearly 70 destroyers. They carried over 900 combat aircraft. Their job was to isolate the battlefield, destroy any Japanese aircraft in the Marianas, and intercept the Imperial Japanese Navy if it dared to show its face. The overarching commander of the Fifth Fleet was Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cold, calculating, and brilliant tactician who had won the Battle of Midway. Spruance was a man who prioritized the protection of his amphibious landing force above all else, a trait that would soon lead to immense controversy. Now, look at the defenders. The Japanese forces on Saipan were organized under the 31st Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata. However, Obata was away on an inspection tour in the Palaus when the invasion fleet arrived, leaving the defense of Saipan in the hands of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, the commander of the 43rd Division. Saito had around 31,000 to 32,000 troops on the island. This included the 43rd Division, the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, and various Naval Guard and anti-aircraft units. Putting Saito in charge was a classic mismatch of doctrine and reality. Saito was an aging cavalry officer. Putting a cavalry officer in charge of a static, heavily fortified island defense is like asking a submarine commander to lead a tank charge. He was out of his element, thrust into a modern war of industrial attrition that his background had not prepared him for. To make matters more complicated, the island also hosted the headquarters of the Central Pacific Area Fleet, commanded by none other than Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Yes, the same Nagumo who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and lost 4 carriers at Midway. Nagumo had been quietly sidelined, essentially exiled to a land-based command on Saipan. The presence of a senior army general and a senior navy admiral on the same island created a fractured command structure, plagued by the bitter, toxic inter-service rivalry that crippled the Japanese military throughout the war. The Army and Navy rarely shared intelligence, hoarded supplies from one another, and often fought 2 separate wars against the same enemy. Did the Japanese know the Americans were coming? Absolutely. You cannot hide an armada of 500 ships. But knowing a hurricane is hitting your state does not mean you know which house it will destroy. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters believed the next American blow would fall further south, perhaps in the Palau Islands or the Carolines, or even a direct thrust toward the Philippines by MacArthur. They did not expect Nimitz to make a massive 1,000-mile leap directly into the Marianas so soon. Therefore, while Saipan was heavily garrisoned, its defensive fortifications were woefully incomplete. The Japanese doctrine in early 1944 was in a state of chaotic transition. For years they had relied on the strategy of annihilating the enemy at the water's edge. This meant placing their bunkers, artillery, and machine guns right on the beach to slaughter the landing craft as they hit the sand. This was the doctrine that bled the Marines at Tarawa. But American naval gunfire and air support had become so overwhelmingly destructive that beach defenses were simply vaporized before the troops even landed. The Japanese were slowly realizing that they needed to adopt a defense-in-depth strategy. This meant abandoning the beaches, pulling back into the hills, digging into the caves, and fighting a war of attrition designed to bleed the Americans for every yard, trading space for blood. Saipan was caught right in the middle of this doctrinal shift. General Saito attempted to build defenses in depth in the rugged mountainous interior of the island, particularly around the 1,554-foot peak of Mount Tapochau. But he lacked the materials. Why? Because the United States Navy's submarine force was executing a masterclass in strategic strangulation. American submarines operating in wolf packs were sinking Japanese merchant shipping at an astronomical rate. When the Japanese tried to reinforce Saipan in the spring of 1944, American subs intercepted the convoys. The transport ships carrying vital cement, steel rebar, barbed wire, and heavy artillery were sent to the bottom of the Pacific. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were rescued from the water and delivered to Saipan without their weapons, without their equipment, and without the materials needed to build concrete bunkers. This situation draws a stark parallel to the Union's Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War, where a relentless naval blockade starved the Confederacy of vital war materials and shattered their economy. Or, if you look at the European theatre, it mirrors the fatal flaw of the French Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a marvel of static engineering, but it was easily bypassed. The Japanese on Saipan were trying to build a Maginot Line out of coral and dirt, but they were entirely isolated by water, with no hope of resupply or reinforcement. They were an army marooned. Without concrete, the Japanese soldiers on Saipan resorted to digging into the island's natural limestone caves and coral ridges, using pickaxes and their bare hands. They dragged their surviving 75mm mountain guns and 105mm howitzers up the steep slopes, camouflaging them perfectly to overlook the western landing beaches. The geography of Saipan was an absolute nightmare for an attacking force. The island is roughly 14 miles long and 5 miles wide. The western side, where the Americans planned to land, featured a barrier reef offshore, a narrow coastal plain, and then a sharp rise into rugged, jungle-covered hills and jagged limestone cliffs. The terrain naturally channeled attacking infantry into kill zones. The Japanese had carefully pre-sighted every inch of the landing beaches. They placed coloured flags in the lagoon to mark the exact ranges for their artillery and mortars. They knew they could not win the battle in the traditional sense. There was no hope of victory. Their only objective was to kill as many Americans as possible, delay the bomber offensive, and perhaps inflict such horrific casualties that the American public would lose the stomach for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. On the American side, the tactical spearhead was the landing vehicle tracked, specifically the LVT-4 Water Buffalo. This amphibious tractor was a game-changer. Unlike the Higgins boats that would get stuck on the coral reefs, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, the LVT had tracks. It could drive right over the reef, swim through the lagoon, and crawl up onto the beach, delivering 30 fully equipped Marines directly to the fight. The LVT-4 was armed with .50 caliber machine guns and provided light armor protection against shrapnel and small arms. Against them, the Japanese possessed the 9th Tank Regiment, equipped with Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks and Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks. By American standards, Japanese tanks were obsolete death traps. The Type 95 weighed just over 8 tons and had armor so thin that a .50 caliber machine gun could punch right through it. But in the dense jungle and rugged terrain of Saipan, used as mobile pillboxes and infantry support, they were still highly lethal. As the first week of June 1944 progressed, the massive American armada steamed westward. The die was cast. The Battle of Saipan was shaping up to be the Pacific equivalent of Gettysburg. In the American Civil War, Gettysburg was the high water mark, the moment where the invading force was broken and the strategic momentum permanently shifted. For the Japanese Empire, Saipan would be their Gettysburg. It was the point of no return. But unlike General Robert E. Lee, who could retreat across the Potomac River and rebuild his army, General Saito had nowhere to go. Behind him was only the deep blue of the Philippine Sea. On June 11th, Task Force 58 arrived off the Marianas. Vice Admiral Mitchell unleashed his carrier air wings. Hundreds of Hellcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers swarmed over Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, obliterating the Japanese air forces on the ground and establishing total air supremacy. Then the fast battleships moved in. For 2 days, 7 modern American battleships, including the USS Washington and the USS North Carolina, fired massive 16-inch shells into the island. On June 14th, the older, slower bombardment battleships arrived, veterans of Pearl Harbor that had been raised from the mud and rebuilt for revenge. They closed the range and fired point-blank into the Japanese positions. The concussions shook the earth. The island vanished beneath a massive cloud of dust, smoke, and pulverized coral. To the Marines watching from the decks of their troop transports, it looked as though nothing could possibly survive that apocalyptic bombardment. They believed the Japanese defenders must have been wiped from the face of the earth. But deep underground, inside the limestone caves and reinforced tunnels, General Saito's men waited in the dark. They clutched their Arisaka rifles, wiped the dust from their Nambu machine guns, and listened to the deafening roar above. They were battered, but they were not broken. As the sun rose on the morning of June 15, 1944, the naval guns suddenly ceased firing. An eerie silence fell over the Philippine Sea. Then the ramps of the landing ships dropped. The engines of 800 amphibious tractors roared to life, and the first wave of American Marines began their long, terrifying crawl toward the smoking beaches of Saipan. At 0843 hours on June 15, 1944, the first wave of 800 landing vehicles tracked crossed the line of departure, churning through the turquoise waters of the Philippine Sea toward the western coast of Saipan. The initial target area was a 4-mile stretch of beach near the town of Charan-Canoa. On the left, the 2nd Marine Division aimed for the green and red beaches. On the right, the 4th Marine Division targeted the blue and yellow beaches. To reach the sand, these amphibious tractors had to cross a barrier reef situated roughly 800 to 1,200 yards offshore. This reef was the exact reason the LVT-4 water buffalo was chosen as the spearhead. A standard flat-bottomed Higgins boat would have slammed into the coral, dropping its ramp in deep water and forcing heavily laden Marines to wade a half-mile through a slaughterhouse of machine gun fire. The LVT, with its dual tracks, simply crawled up onto the coral, ground its way over the jagged reef, and plunged into the shallow lagoon on the other side. But the Japanese were waiting. General Saito's artillerymen had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. They had waded out into the lagoon and planted dozens of brightly colored flags in the water. These were not obstacles. They were pre-registered range markers. The moment the American LVTs crossed the reef and passed those flags, the Japanese artillery commanders, hidden in the hills, simply barked out the corresponding coordinates to their gun crews. They did not need to aim. They just loaded, fired, and let the geometry of the battlefield do the killing. Suddenly, the lagoon erupted. Type 91 105mm howitzers and 75mm mountain guns rained high-explosive shells down on the American landing craft. The LVTs were unarmored on top. When an artillery shell scored a direct hit on the open troop compartment, it instantly vaporized the 30 Marines huddled inside, turning the amphibious tractor into a burning, sinking, iron coffin. Why did the massive American naval bombardment fail to wipe out these Japanese artillery positions? The answer lies in the fundamental physics of naval gunfire and the brilliant, lethal adaptation of the Japanese defenders. Battleship guns fire at high velocities with relatively flat trajectories. They are designed to punch through the heavy side armor of other warships. But the Japanese had positioned their artillery on the reverse slopes of the limestone hills and deep inside reinforced cave networks. A flat trajectory 16-inch shell from a battleship would simply sail right over the hill or smash harmlessly into the forward face of the ridge. The Japanese would roll their artillery pieces to the mouth of a cave, fire a barrage into the lagoon, and immediately roll the guns back into the mountain before the American destroyers could pinpoint their muzzle flashes. It was a masterclass in asymmetric defense. The Marines who survived the gauntlet of the lagoon hit the beaches and immediately realized they were in a completely different kind of hell. This was not like the Normandy landings that had taken place just 9 days earlier. At Omaha Beach, the American infantry had the shingle and the seawall to provide at least some temporary cover from the German machine guns. On Saipan, there was no seawall. There was no cover. The beaches were narrow strips of white sand, backed by open swamps, sugarcane fields, and a steep incline leading directly into the Japanese guns. It was an exposed kill zone, reminiscent of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, except this time the charging infantry had nowhere to retreat and were pinned against the ocean. Furthermore, strong currents and jagged coral heads had forced the LVTs to drift during the run-in. A massive 2,000-yard gap opened up between the 2nd Marine Division on the left and the 4th Marine Division on the right, centered right around a Fetner Point. This gap exposed the flanks of both divisions, allowing Japanese snipers and machine gunners to pour enfilading fire into the American lines. As night fell on June 15th, the Americans had a tenuous foothold, but they had suffered over 2,000 casualties in a single day. The Marines dug shallow foxholes in the sand, set up their water-cooled .30 caliber Browning machine guns, and waited. They knew what was coming. Japanese military doctrine rigidly dictated that any amphibious landing must be met with an immediate, overwhelming nighttime counterattack to push the invaders back into the sea before they could unload their heavy armor and artillery. General Saito ordered the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Goto, to spearhead this assault. At 0330 hours, the darkness was shattered by the clanking of steel tracks and the roar of diesel engines. Roughly 40 Japanese tanks, accompanied by hundreds of infantrymen, charged out of the hills and slammed directly into the positions held by the 6th Marine Regiment. This brings us to a critical analysis of the armor deployed on the battlefield. The Japanese relied heavily on the Type 95 Ha-Go light tank and the Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tank. By 1944 standards, these machines were dangerously obsolete. The Type 95 weighed just over 8 tons, possessed a maximum armor thickness of only 12 millimeters, and was armed with a low-velocity 37 millimeter gun. The armor was literally riveted together, not welded. When struck by heavy fire, even if the shell did not penetrate, the rivets would snap off and ricochet around the interior of the crew compartment like deadly shrapnel. Why would a commander throw obsolete light tanks against heavily armed Marine infantry in the dark? Because the Japanese High Command believed that spiritual superiority, aggressive shock tactics, and the element of surprise could overcome material deficiencies. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Marines were waiting for them with M1A1 bazookas and 37mm anti-tank guns. The bazooka fired a shaped charge explosive that easily melted through the thin Japanese armor, turning the tanks into blazing pyres. Then, the American M4A2 Sherman tanks arrived on the line. The Sherman was a 30-ton behemoth compared to the Japanese armor. It boasted 2.5 inches of sloped frontal armor and a high-velocity 75mm main gun. When the Shermans opened fire, it was not a battle, it was an execution. The 75mm armor-piercing shells punched clean through the front of the Japanese tanks and exited out the rear, blowing the turrets clean off the chassis. By dawn, the 9th Tank Regiment was effectively annihilated, leaving a graveyard of smoking, shattered steel in front of the Marine lines. With the beaches secured and the initial counterattacks broken, the Americans began to push inland. On June 16th, they captured Aslito Airfield in the south, immediately renaming it Isley Field, which would soon become the very bomber base they had come to build. To reinforce the advance, General Holland Smith ordered the Army's 27th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Ralph Smith, to land and take over the center of the line. The battle now shifted from a chaotic amphibious assault into a grueling, yard-by-yard infantry slugfest. The terrain of Saipan changed dramatically as the troops moved inland. The sugarcane fields gave way to dense jungle and jagged, razor-sharp limestone karst. This volcanic rock was so abrasive that it shredded the soles of combat boots in a matter of days and tore the skin off any man who tried to crawl over it. The Japanese retreated into this nightmare landscape, utilizing hundreds of natural caves and crevices. They heavily fortified these positions with concrete, steel doors, and interlocking fields of fire. This required a fundamental shift in American infantry tactics. You could not simply shoot a Japanese soldier in a cave. You had to destroy the cave itself. This birthed the brutal doctrine known as blowtorch and corkscrew. The corkscrew was the explosive. Combat engineers would crawl under heavy sniper fire to the mouth of a cave and hurl 20-pound satchel charges packed with C4 plastic explosive inside, collapsing the entrance and burying the defenders alive. The blowtorch was the M2A1 flamethrower. The M2A1 was one of the most terrifying and psychologically devastating weapons in the American arsenal. It consisted of 2 large tanks worn on the operator's back, containing 4 gallons of thickened, jellied gasoline, and a smaller tank of compressed nitrogen to propel the fuel. Fully loaded, it weighed nearly 70 pounds. The operator had to waddle through jagged coral, completely exposed, to get within 40 yards of a heavily defended pillbox. If a Japanese sniper put a bullet into the pressurized tanks, the operator could be instantly immolated. But when the flamethrower fired, it shot a rod of burning liquid at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit directly into the cave mouth. The fire would bounce off the rock walls, turning the bunker into a high-pressure oven. Even if the flames did not touch the defenders, the fire instantly consumed all the oxygen in the cave, suffocating anyone deep inside the tunnel network. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, who fights to the death, and who uses the very earth as a fortress? You burn them out, or you seal them in. This subterranean nightmare draws heavy parallels to the trench-clearing operations of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in World War I, or the brutal, claustrophobic tunnel warfare that American forces would later face in Vietnam. It was a war stripped of all romance, reduced to men throwing explosives into dark holes and listening to the screams. By late June, the American advance formed a massive U-shape. The 2nd Marine Division pushed up the western coast. The 4th Marine Division pushed up the eastern coast. In the center, the Army's 27th Infantry Division was tasked with clearing a heavily fortified ravine that the troops quickly named Death Valley, flanked by a towering limestone ridge dubbed Purple Heart Ridge. The 27th Division walked right into a perfectly designed Japanese kill zone. General Saito had placed his remaining artillery and heavy machine guns on the high ground of Purple Heart Ridge, looking down directly into the valley. Every time the Army infantrymen tried to advance, they were pinned down by plunging fire from hidden caves that could not be seen until they opened up. The 27th Division ground to a bloody halt. This created a massive tactical problem. Because the Army was stalled in the center, the Marine divisions advancing on the flanks were dangerously exposed. Their interior flanks were hanging in the wind, vulnerable to counterattack. Marine General Holland Smith was furious. He looked at the map and saw the Marines moving while the Army sat still. He believed the 27th Division lacked aggressive leadership and was moving too cautiously. Army General Ralph Smith argued that his men were fighting through a geographical meat grinder, facing the heaviest concentration of Japanese defenses on the island, and that a blind frontal assault would be a suicidal waste of American lives. Does a Marine general have the right to relieve an Army general in the middle of a massive firefight? On Saipan, he did, and it caused a political earthquake that reached all the way back to the Pentagon in Washington. On June 24th, with the authorization of Admiral Spruance, Holland Smith abruptly fired Ralph Smith, replacing him with Army Major General Sandiford Jarman. This highly controversial decision ignited a bitter inter-service feud between the Army and the Marine Corps that lasted for decades. It highlighted a fundamental clash in military doctrine. The Marine Corps was trained for rapid, aggressive amphibious assaults, accepting high initial casualties to secure a beachhead quickly and rely on naval supply. The Army was trained for methodical, sustained land warfare, relying on heavy organic artillery and careful maneuvering to minimize infantry losses. Both doctrines were valid, but on the bloody ridges of Saipan, they violently collided. Despite the command crisis, the American war machine ground forward. The key to the entire Japanese defensive line was Mount Tapochau, a 1,554-foot peak that dominated the center of the island. Whoever held the summit of Tapochau controlled Saipan, because they could call in devastatingly accurate artillery fire on any movement below. On June 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Rathvon Tompkins led the 1st Battalion, 29th Marines, in a daring flanking maneuver up the sheer cliff faces of the mountain. Bypassing the heavily defended trails, the Marines scaled the jagged rock, using ropes, fighting hand-to-hand with Japanese defenders in the crevices. By nightfall, they had secured the summit. The capture of Mount Tapochau broke the back of the Japanese defense in depth. American artillery spotters now sat on the highest peak, looking down at the remaining Japanese positions. The 31st Army was fractured, bleeding, and out of supplies. General Saito and his surviving troops were pushed relentlessly northward, corralled into a narrowing peninsula of jagged rock and dense jungle, known as the Valley of Hell. They had no food. They had no fresh water. The American naval blockade ensured that not a single bullet or bandage would reach them. Saito was trapped in a cave with over 3,000 wounded men, his command structure shattered, and his island fortress burning around him. But surrender was a concept entirely absent from the Imperial Japanese military code. The battle was lost, but the killing was far from over. Saito was about to issue a final order that would unleash the largest, most terrifying, and completely suicidal infantry charge in the history of the Pacific War. By the evening of July 6th, General Yoshitsugu Saito knew that his command had ceased to exist as a functional military unit. His remaining forces were compressed into a tiny, jagged pocket on the northernmost tip of Saipan, starving, diseased, and entirely out of ammunition for their heavy weapons. For a Japanese commander of his era, surrender was not a military option, nor was it a moral one. The Bushido Code dictated that a warrior must die in battle to preserve his honor and serve the emperor. Saito drafted a final message to his remaining troops, declaring that whether they attacked or stayed where they were, they would die. Therefore, he ordered a gyokusai, a term that translates to shattering like a beautiful jewel. In the West, we call it a banzai charge. It was to be a final, all-out assault designed not to win the battle, but to inflict the maximum possible psychological and physical damage on the Americans before the Japanese garrison was annihilated. Too old, sick, and wounded to lead the charge himself, Saito ate a final meal of canned crab meat and sake, then committed ritual suicide in his cave, his adjutant shooting him in the back of the head as he drew his sword. At 04:45 hours on the morning of July 7th, the American lines were eerily quiet. The 105th Infantry Regiment of the Army's 27th Division held the forward positions near the coastal village of Tanapag. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered by the screams of over 4,000 Japanese soldiers. This was not a tactical assault, it was a human avalanche. The vanguard consisted of the remaining able-bodied infantrymen, armed with Arisaka Type 99 rifles and light machine guns. Behind them came the walking wounded, men wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, hobbling on crutches, armed with nothing but bayonets lashed to bamboo poles, rocks, and even bare fists. How do you stop an enemy who has already accepted death as a prerequisite for battle? You rely on the brutal, unyielding arithmetic of automatic weapons. The American infantrymen opened up with everything they had. The core of the American defensive line was the Browning M1917A1 water-cooled machine gun. This was a heavy, tripod-mounted weapon that weighed nearly 90 pounds with its water jacket filled. It was designed for one specific purpose: sustained, continuous fire. The gun crews held their triggers down, firing 600 rounds per minute into the mass of charging bodies. The water inside the cooling jackets boiled, turning to steam that hissed into the morning air, but the guns kept firing. The slaughter was industrial in its efficiency, but the sheer kinetic mass of 4,000 charging men simply overwhelmed the physics of the American defense. The Japanese absorbed the bullets, stepped over the piles of their own dead, and crashed into the American foxholes. The battle instantly devolved into a prehistoric, hand-to-hand nightmare. Rifles were swung like baseball bats, entrenching tools were used as axes, and men gouged at each other's eyes in the mud. In the center of this chaos stood Captain Ben L. Salomon, the battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry. Salomon was a dentist by trade. When the Japanese overran his aid station and began bayoneting the wounded Americans on their stretchers, the dentist picked up an M1 Garand rifle and fought back. When his rifle ran dry, he took over a .30 caliber machine gun after its crew was killed. He ordered his remaining medics to evacuate the wounded while he stayed behind alone to hold the line. When American forces finally retook the position days later, they found Captain Salomon's body slumped over his machine gun, riddled with 76 bullet and bayonet wounds. Piled in front of his position were the bodies of 98 Japanese soldiers. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, a testament to the absolute savagery of the close-quarters fighting. The human wave pushed entirely through the 105th Infantry Regiment, completely destroying its 1st and 2nd battalions, and crashed into the rear echelon artillery positions of the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines. Artillerymen are not frontline infantry, but on Saipan, the front line came to them. The Marines leveled their 105mm howitzers, setting the fuses to detonate at 0 seconds. They loaded the guns with beehive or canister rounds, essentially turning a massive artillery piece into a gigantic shotgun. When they fired point-blank into the charging Japanese, the concussive force and thousands of steel balls literally vaporized entire platoons at a time. By late afternoon, the momentum of the Banzai charge finally broke. Over 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead in a confined area barely half a mile wide. The stench of blood and ruptured organs was so overpowering in the tropical heat that combat veterans were violently ill. This suicidal tactic draws a direct historical parallel to the massive Chinese human wave offensives launched against American Marines at the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War. In both instances, an enemy lacking heavy armor and air support relied on the sheer psychological shock and overwhelming mass of human bodies to break a heavily armed American perimeter. However, unlike the Chinese forces in Korea, who used human waves as a calculated operational tactic to overrun positions and win the battle, the Japanese at Saipan used it purely as a mechanism for a glorious death. It was a fatal waste of manpower that achieved nothing strategically. With the military garrison effectively destroyed, the American forces pushed to the extreme northern cliffs of the island, an area known as Marpi Point. Here they encountered a horror that transcended the bounds of conventional warfare. Tens of thousands of Japanese civilians, the sugarcane farmers and their families who had colonized Saipan, were trapped against the ocean. For weeks, Japanese military propaganda had bombarded these civilians with terrifying lies. They were told that the American Marines were literal demons who would rape the women, torture the men, and feed the children to their war dogs. Believing these lies, and driven to absolute madness by weeks of naval bombardment and starvation, the civilian population chose death. What happens when a totalitarian regime successfully weaponizes the fear of its own people? You get the tragedy of Banzai Cliff. Entire families walked to the edge of the 800-foot limestone cliffs. Mothers clutched their infants to their chests and stepped off into the churning ocean below. Fathers detonated grenades against their own stomachs, killing their wives and children in a single, brutal explosion. American Marines, hardened by weeks of merciless combat, stood on the cliff edges and wept. They brought up Japanese-speaking interpreters, using loudspeakers to beg the civilians to surrender, promising them food, water, and medical care. A few surrendered, but thousands chose the rocks. Over 8,000 civilians died in this mass suicide. This horrifying event mirrors the ancient siege of Masada, where Judean rebels chose mass suicide over enslavement by the Roman legions. It is a chilling reminder of the destructive power of state-sponsored psychological conditioning. On July 9, 1944, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner declared the island of Saipan officially secured. The cost was staggering: The American forces suffered over 16,000 casualties, including nearly 3,500 dead. The Japanese garrison of 30,000 men was virtually annihilated, with only a few hundred taken prisoner, mostly because they were too severely wounded to kill themselves. But the strategic implications of this bloodbath were immediate and world-changing. Let us analyze the multidimensional impact of the battle, starting with the political shockwave. How does a military dictatorship survive when the foundational myth of its invincibility is shattered? It does not. On July 18, 1944, when the news of Saipan's fall reached Tokyo, the political fallout was catastrophic. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the absolute dictator of the Japanese war effort, was forced to resign in disgrace. The Japanese High Command realized, with cold clarity, that the war was irrevocably lost. The absolute national defense sphere had been punctured. The American dagger was now pointed directly at the heart of the home islands. Logistically and economically, the capture of Saipan demonstrated the terrifying, unstoppable might of the American industrial machine. Even before the final gunshots faded in the northern cliffs, the United States Navy Seabees, the naval construction battalions, were already at work. These men were not infantry. They were engineers, heavy equipment operators, and construction workers armed with bulldozers and dynamite. They looked at the pulverized remains of Aslito Airfield and began one of the most rapid and massive engineering projects in military history. The logistics of this operation are mind-boggling. The Americans shipped millions of tons of crushed coral, asphalt, steel matting, and aviation fuel across 5,000 miles of hostile ocean. They leveled hills, filled in swamps, and laid down massive 8,500-foot runways designed to handle the immense weight of the B-29 superfortress. Compare this logistical supremacy to the Japanese situation. The Japanese could not even resupply a garrison a few hundred miles from their own naval bases, relying on starving men digging caves with hand tools. The Americans, meanwhile, built a multi-million-dollar, state-of-the-art aviation complex on a freshly conquered burning rock on the other side of the planet. This reflects the same industrial mismatch seen in the American Civil War, where the Union Army could lay miles of fresh railroad track and telegraph wire in days, while the Confederate Army slowly starved, lacking the basic industrial capacity to manufacture boots or replace broken rifles. War is ultimately a contest of economies, and at Saipan, the American economy arrived on the beach with overwhelming force. From an intelligence perspective, Saipan was a gold mine. American Navajo code talkers had operated flawlessly throughout the battle, transmitting complex artillery coordinates and tactical orders in a language the Japanese could never decipher. This provided the Marines with real-time, secure communication that was completely immune to enemy interception. Furthermore, American intelligence officers captured thousands of pages of Japanese military documents in the caves. By translating these documents, American planners gained invaluable insights into the shifting Japanese defensive doctrine, the state of their ammunition reserves, and the deep, crippling divisions between the Japanese Army and Navy. The tactical lessons learned at Saipan dictated the bloody future of the Pacific War. The Japanese realized that attempting to stop the Americans at the water's edge was a futile waste of lives. Naval gunfire was simply too powerful. Saipan taught them that they had to abandon the beaches entirely, dig deep into the earth, and force the Americans into a grinding, subterranean war of pure attrition. This evolution in Japanese tactics directly set the stage for the horrific bloodbaths that would soon follow at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For the Americans, Saipan proved that massive naval bombardment, while devastating, was not enough to clear heavily fortified terrain. They learned that specialized weapons, specifically the flamethrower and the armored bulldozer, were the only effective tools for breaking a determined, entrenched enemy. By October of 1944, the skies over Saipan roared with a new, terrifying sound. The B-29 superfortresses of the 21st Bomber Command began arriving on Isley Field. The billion-dollar gamble had paid off. From the runways built on the blood-soaked coral of the Marianas, these massive silver bombers began their relentless campaign against the Japanese home islands. They would drop thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, burning the Japanese war industry to ashes. And just a few miles away, on the neighboring island of Tinian, another runway was built. It was from that runway, in August of 1945, that a B-29 named the Enola Gay would lift off, carrying a single atomic bomb, destined for Hiroshima. None of that would have been possible without the 24 days of absolute hell endured by the Marines and Army infantrymen on Saipan. The Battle of Saipan was the hinge upon which the Pacific War turned. It was the moment the Japanese Empire was fundamentally broken, and the moment the United States secured the physical means to end the conflict. It was a battle defined by the clash of modern industrial warfare against fanatical, suicidal devotion, resulting in a landscape of unimaginable human suffering. History is not just a record of the dead, but a mirror reflecting the extreme limits of human endurance and the devastating consequences of national fanaticism. When a society is conditioned to fear the enemy more than death itself, the resulting tragedy leaves scars that outlast the weapons that caused them. What do you believe was the most decisive factor in the American victory at Saipan? A. The overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority of the American forces.
B. The catastrophic failure of Japanese inter-service cooperation and outdated tactics.
C. The successful deployment of specialized infantry weapons like the flamethrower and the bazooka. Let us know your tactical assessment in the comments below.